Welcome to our last spring 2020 edition of Engagement That Scales with Rachel Happy. We are recording on a special off day because we have a special guest. Take it away, Rachel.
Thank you, Shannon and Charlene. It's so nice to have you here.
Thank you so much for having me.
This is a relatively short podcast conversation, but I want to talk to about something with you that you have been talking a lot about today. But before we get to leadership and having hard conversations, let's warm up a little bit. If you could just tell me what you've been up to recently, what you're thinking about, what you're working on, and then we can kind of like move into talking about the good stuff.
Sure. Yeah, I have been writing about disruption for 20 years now as an analyst. I'm feeling very old sometimes talking about that. And I wrote my latest book called The Disruption Mindset last fall, not having any clue what was going to be coming out of that, right? So I updated it this past April with a whole preface around how to deal with the disruption around COVID. And then this other disruption comes rolling in right on top of that. And so a lot of the work right now I'm doing is around how do we talk about disruption in the context of social injustice. That if we really want to create disruption as leaders, it can't be just about our organizations. It also needs to be about our communities and our society in general. So how do we do that?
Yeah, I mean, and I've been very intrigued watching your work, and I'm getting wrapped up in the middle of a lot of those conversations as well. And it's fascinating to see who's better or worse prepared for them, or who tends to have a more natural time or more comfortable time kind of getting into them. And it's interesting, you mentioned 20 years. I don't think I've been doing disruption per se that long. But I recently pulled up an old slide of mine that I used 10 years ago that basically said the perfect storm is rolling in. And I just crossed out rolling in because I was like, I think it's here.
It's here.
It's here. I mean, maybe there's more because it's 2020 and it's only June. So
yeah, we are on this huge roller coaster. And some of the things I've been talking about with leaders is how do you prioritize with all of these emergencies and everything being urgent? How on earth, what do you do? What do you even look at first, think about first?
What are you hearing from those leaders about what they're choosing to do?
They're hanging by their fingernails and they're just saying, I'm just basically doing whack-a-mole. They feel like they're doing whack-a-mole. I deal with reopening, okay, over there. I'm dealing with a COVID update over here. I'm dealing with really upset remote workers over here. I'm dealing with my black colleagues completely just distraught and torn to pieces over here. I'm dealing with my family over here who's freaking out and they want to go do protesting. Like, no, you got to say, I mean, it just goes on and on.
Yeah.
So
that creates a lot of anxiety. I mean, how can you not be torn down in that environment where everybody needs you emotionally?
Right. And I think it's especially hard for leaders because, and I don't mean leaders by title, I mean people who have put themselves forward as agents of change in whatever context that is. It could be a leader within your family, whatever it is. But it is so difficult. So you really have to build resilience. You have to build that time and space to preserve yourself. Because if you don't do that, take care of yourself first, feed yourself, have compassion for yourself. I know that as a working mom, being an entrepreneur, and being an analyst and writing books on top of it, my life was going completely bonkers.
Yeah.
And people are like, so how are your friends doing? I kind of laugh like, huh, what friends? Like, what do you mean?
You have like 4 out of 5, right? And 5 doesn't matter, whatever it was.
I realized I was not doing a good job of my other things if I was doing that. And trying to balance everything was insane. So I live by the adage that there is no such thing as balance. There's just an unending stream of less than optimal compromises you have to make.
I like that. I like that. And actually, one of the things I was going to ask you, and you got to this just a little bit, which is before we talk about communicating tough things as leaders, how do you think about what leadership is?
I think leadership is a relationship. between the people who are inspired to create change and people who are inspired by them to follow them to create that change. That's what leaders do. We create change. Because if you just want to keep the status quo going, hey, we got managers to do that, right? If you want to be a manager, great. That's what you do really well, is to maintain and optimize the status quo. Leaders are needed to create that change. And you create that change because of the relationship you have with the people who will follow you into that new space.
It begs the question, which is, are a lot of our executives today leaders, or are they managers?
I think many of them are managers. I even asked the question, like, how many of you are leaders? And they kind of tend, I mean, these are the executives of the firm. They're kind of like, yeah, I guess I'm a leader. I'm like, no, are you creating change? The hands go down. I go, how comfortable are you leading change? Hands go really down. They're sitting on them. And so this is a rethinking and a call for leadership, because we need leaders today. We're going through so much change.
It's fascinating, because when I was coming up in the business world, and actually it's one of the reasons I never could access personally the label of leader, because leader and executive were so conflated as the same thing. And I remember, I don't know when it was, years ago, somebody saying, well, you know, do you consider yourself a leader? And I was like, no, like that doesn't apply to me. And as I've matured, maybe I've become more empowered, I don't know, but because I've separated the two, you can be anyone, and you can be a leader and actually you could define leadership as willing to have the hard conversations.
It is, because if you're going to create change, then having difficult, hard, taxing, emotional conversations is at the core of this. And if you're not willing to have them, you really got to step back and say, why am I not willing to have it? Is it because, what is it holding me back? But do I really want this change? How much do I want this change to happen? And at the core of it is a relationship. And if I can't have a relationship that's built in trust, that is cleared, the air is cleared of any sort of conflicts that may be holding us back, then we're not living in integrity with each other in that relationship. And we all think that we are people of integrity. But when we walk around and don't have these difficult conversations, then we are not acting with integrity.
Well, somebody actually, and this was a real aha to me, and I forget what context I was having the conversation in, but somebody was saying to me, a lot of life, if you're not a leader, you're betraying yourself, because you're fitting into someone else's world rather than creating your own world. And that really hit me in an interesting way, because I've always been a people pleaser. And I think it was somewhat in that discussion of like, if you need to please people too much, you're betraying yourself, and you can't, eventually that sucks your energy more than being true to yourself.
Right. Well, the core of being a great leader is self-awareness, like truly knowing yourself and what you stand for, what's important to you. What do you feel is important to fight for, but also to speak out about, and being true to yourself. Because if you aren't aware of who you are and what you stand for, then you're going to just blow with the wind, and that may be okay. But then you're not a leader. You don't have that foundation to be able to do that. Leaders really, people say like, how do I be the best leader possible? I go, know thyself. Start with that. Really know who you are. And that means also your weaknesses, where you tend to fall down, where your pitfalls are, having that humility to be able to say, I can't do this alone.
Yeah. Yeah, it's really fascinating, because one of the things I was thinking of as we were doing research this year is there's a lot of organizations that started as communities with a really strong guiding principle. And over the years, that has created a lot of wealth. And as it's created more wealth, they've reverted into managing, right? They're no longer leading, they're managing their assets. And they're starting to create a lot of fragility in their ecosystem because they're living in the past. They're living in the shared purpose of 100 years ago, not in the future. And they're losing themselves as they're doing that because they can't make decisions in this really volatile environment because the context has changed so much. And so I've been thinking about that lens on leadership a lot as it pertains to a lot of executives and saying, are we hiring people who really want to disrupt?
Yeah, I'm on this mission and creating a movement where disruption is seen as a positive thing, something to run towards rather than try to avoid. Because we've given disruption a really bad name in that we want to avoid it, but I actually think disrupting the status quo and questioning it all is not to say it's bad, but I automatically assume that if things are staying the same, it's probably not a good thing.
Yeah.
Because if you're not even exploring to see what needs to change, if you have taken a look into the future, you've really examined it, given that it's full throttle, and you know, where we are right now is actually a good place to be. I'm 100% in agreement with that. But if you haven't looked, you haven't even considered that things could be different, then you are not fighting for the people you're trying to serve.
Well, I would say, even if everything's fine, you turn everything over and it's fine, you're not growing if you're not disrupting, right? And when I had my daughter, when you have little kids, you know the pattern of progress and regression and progress. And you'd get to those points where like everything would fall apart and you'd be like, last week, everything was great. And now you're a disaster. And you're like, what is going on? And then the next week they learn to walk or they learn to ride a bike or whatever it is. And I don't think that pattern actually goes away, right? Like growth comes from disruption, right?
Yeah.
Like,
Rachel, I think you're describing my life today. You know, where it's just like, I take 2 steps forward, I take 3 steps back. Sometimes I'm running forward. And but I feel so alive because I'm growing, I'm trying new things. I know I'm alive because I feel the pain and agony, but also the exhilaration.
yeah.
I think about it as athletes and artists. We really truly understand disruption and what it means to move forward, to strive for something bigger than what we're doing today. Because that's what artists and athletes do. We always want to do better and be more, I mean, just push ourselves. But we know along the way, we're constantly failing too.
You say that because like my background is innovation before I got into the community space. And a few years ago, I had this insight of like the real front end of innovation is art, because we can't describe, we have this feeling that there's something wrong, but we can't put words to it. And so we throw paint on canvas or we do whatever our art tells us to do. And then other people in trying to describe what the art is doing help put words to and give that art meaning because of the context. So it's leadership as art, maybe, I don't know. Let's transition to, okay, now let's talk about the difficult conversation of race, because it's fascinating to me that there are difficult conversations and there's difficult conversations. And it's one thing if your supply chain's not working and you need new partners, and you know that's a tough negotiation. And it's a whole different thing if we're talking about racial injustice and our place in that. And so how do you advise people get comfortable or not with that conversation?
I think the first thing is to acknowledge it's a very uncomfortable conversation to have. And the sooner we get comfortable with it going to be uncomfortable and just hard.
Why is it so uncomfortable?
Well, it's easy to have it with people who you agree with, but even with people you agree with, like, are we exactly on the same page? There's this need to have agreement on this. when we know there are so many nuances about race. And because it's not polite conversation to necessarily have, it's kind of like with religion and politics and all the other things you're not supposed to have polite conversation around. We tend not to go there because it pushes so many sensitive buttons, and we just don't know what's on the other side. So we don't go there. We don't open those doors. And we're also afraid that we're going to say something wrong as leaders. We're going to show up badly. We're going to say the wrong thing. We're going to stick our foot right down our throat. We're afraid of cancel culture. I had one leader come up and was like, I know exactly how I feel about this, but I do not feel safe. Like, well, this is your company. You're the CEO. And he goes, yeah, but we have so many different people. I don't think I can create that space for all of these different voices to come forward. And everyone's just incredibly emotional about it. You got some people over here who are like Black Lives Matter, and people over here like white privilege is a lie. Like, how on earth do we bring and have a conversation around that together? And I go, if these are the same people in your company, you have to have those conversations. You have to be able to acknowledge the fact that these are conversations that are happening, and that you're not trying to get everyone to agree. That's, I think, the most important thing. You're not trying to get everyone to agree. You're not trying to push down one point of view.
One of the best techniques that I've seen, and my daughter's school has a director of community, and he does a lot of EQ work. And he has a real softness about him. And what he does is he makes space, and then he asks everybody to share their experience. And I think in our world, in the business world, everyone wants to jump towards answers, and it's such a complicated problem. And there's no one answer, right? Like, there's going to be a different answer to everybody based on where they're coming from and who they are and how they present in the world and a lot of other things. And so I found that's one way to start that conversation, is just, what's been your experience with race?
Yes, exactly. And I think a couple of things. Be really clear what the purpose of the conversation is. Number one, is it, and again, I talk about these conversations in the context of business or organizations, but I've had many leaders come in and ask, how do I even have this conversation with my parent? Right? How do I do this with a loved one, a colleague, a close colleague, a friend of mine? Never, again, I hear them say these things and it really bothers me. And I think the way to have that conversation is, what's the purpose of it? If the purpose is, I want to make our relationship as strong as possible, you make that very explicit, the purpose of this conversation. You're starting from the strength and the foundation of the relationship. And just a reminder to each other, we're entering into this because we value this relationship and we want to have this conversation so we become closer, not further apart. And we commit to each other to have this, to truly listen to each other with our full hearts. If you don't begin the conversation with that foundation, you're going to go spinning off into all these different places. Yeah. And then make sure you have agreements, especially if it's an organization. You have agreements. If you have to, write them down, put them into the chat session, have them like floating behind you on the wall or something, that we're going to listen with respect and empathy, that we're not going to interrupt, that we're going to make space with different opinions, and we're not trying to get to agreement. It's a really important thing to say down here. It's a conversation. This isn't a planning session. There's a time and place for that. But we cannot have those planning discussions unless we are facile with these conversations. And then you can have a conversation starter. Conversation starters is like, share a point of your past week that you're really grateful for. Like something really easy, but you're getting into that mode of sharing your experience. I love what your child's school is doing. This is about my experiences, my point of view. And the conversations that we have when we deepen it is, give an example if you've ever witnessed injustice, if you've ever witnessed racial disparity. And this is your observations of the world when you see it. When somebody says racism doesn't exist, well, this is a place where they can hear from people. Like, this is where I have seen it, or even closer when I have experienced it. And then we can move even deeper into more complex conversations. Like, when does white privilege enter into our daily lives? When does privilege show up? And what does privilege mean?
Mm.
I was just having a conversation with someone. It's like, white privilege is a lie. It doesn't exist when you characterize an entire race. I'm like, let's dig deeper into this. I would like to know where you're coming from. I want to hear that person's experience. I want to listen, understand it, because I don't understand that. And then I would hope that they would listen to my experience too.
Yeah.
Is how I understand it to be, how my learning around this has evolved and changed.
It's interesting because I have an analyst personality. I can't help myself. Like, that's who I am. And one of the things I've also observed is people really struggle with not making it about them, meaning getting privilege and racism confused, meaning you're not. And so there's a lot of guilt, there's a lot of misplaced guilt, and or especially in the white side of this. Listening to somebody a couple of weeks ago really hit home for me in a way that I don't share. This is privilege, right? This is privilege I can't see, which is I never walk through the world thinking, I'm a white woman. I don't put white next to my name, like in my head. I'm not walking through the world as a white woman. Because I don't have to think about it. Because there's no implication for me for that. And that removes a whole set of energy, time, emotional drains that I don't even, so like white privilege doesn't exist. It doesn't exist for me because I have it.
You have it. That's the whole idea.
Like,
and the realization when I see my friends deal with this, the privilege that you have because of race, because of social economic, because of where you went to school, whatever it is, that you don't have to deal with these things. It kind of hits them with a huge bowling ball, and then this huge guilt and shame. I'm like, great, understand that. Please move out of that and really understand that now. How do you see the world now? And how are the things that you're going to be thinking about things differently? And how will you acknowledge that privilege exists? And what will you do about it? And those are really, that's the hard part.
It's actually the easy part is what I was saying, is if you can get beyond the guilt, if you can get past that, and I think that's what people mean when they say it's not about you. Like, it's not about my guilt or like what I did do, or I did not intentionally create the patriarchy. Like, if I did, like, one, I'm suffering from more trauma than I thought, but I didn't intentionally create the system. So I'm not guilty of creating systemic racism, but the things I choose to do either support or counter it. And so that's like, if I can analyze it as a system, I can see where I can impact it.
Right.
And I think, and something you said earlier, which is something very present on my mind, I feel like a lot of people don't have compassion for themselves. And moving into these complex, transformative, disruptive conversations, there's no one answer. And so everything we're taught is to like find the answer and do that. And none of these problems have one answer. And so if we can't have compassion for ourselves, that we did the best that we could with what we knew at the time where we were, and that was good enough. If we can't say that to ourselves, the emotional burden is so great that how can you not freeze?
Right.
From that.
I talked to one leader, and I really respected their approach to this. I didn't necessarily agree with it, but I respected it. And they said, I hear everything that's going on, and there's nothing I can do about this whole system of racism. But what my focus is going to be is he's Asian American. He said, I'm going to focus on the Asian American, elevating leaders, promoting them. And that's the work that I know I can do and am passionate about. So that's how I'm going to address it. I'm like, that's great. I support that. I wish you would dig a little bit deeper into what's going on there so you know what's up. But hey, in your own time, right?
You know, everybody has their own priorities, right? Like you're at a unique place with your unique experiences, with your unique opportunities. If that's what you can fit in today, God bless, right? Like we're not all, and none of us are going to solve it, no matter how hard we work today.
Yeah, I've been impressed. I've been noticing, and as I'm in various executive groups, and how quiet it has been. Incredibly quiet. Everyone's walking on eggshells. I'm even walking on eggshells, and this is like an executive group that I really love and adore. But how can we talk about this? And the door has been slammed in my face. This is not a social justice group. We are an executive team group. You know, we are not here to promote social injustice. I'm like, that's not what I'm talking about, showing up as a leader, right? And so it is fraught. I mean, leadership right now is very much frozen, I believe, because of our inability and comfort level at having these conversations. COVID was easy compared to this.
So let me ask a more personal question, which is, how have you gotten to a place where, not in all contexts, but you're comfortable talking about it?
I started talking about my lived experience about being a woman of color in executive ranks in a space that's pretty much dominated by old, tall white men. And I am none of those things. I'm getting older, so I'm getting that, but I'm definitely keeping the white out of my hair.
If you get a tie clip and a polyester shirt going, you'll fit right in.
Exactly. So I don't fit any of the stereotypes for being a thought leader in business and strategy and leadership. I defy every single stereotype. And I talk about that I started talking about that on stage about 5 years ago. I was not comfortable until then. And doing that, being present, knowing the fact that I am in a room as the only had always been a really difficult thing, to raise my hand and speak up as the only. Because I feel like I'm speaking out for my entire gender, for my entire race, for anybody who's young, and it goes on. And I don't give a whit anymore. I just went, if there's a conversation that needs to be had, I am trying to be fearless in the face of that. And I will raise my hand and speak my truth, no matter what context I'm in, with the utmost respect, with a tremendous amount of empathy where people are in the room. But it could be anything from calling up my colleague for using a racist comment. And he's like, you know, that person has a China man's chance. That company has a China man's chance of being successful. I'm like, where did they come from? And I was just like, I called him on it as soon as he got up to say, great speech. That's this one thing. He goes, I don't know. He goes, I'm horrified that I even said
Open the kimono for years. Oh my
Open the kimono. I was like, what is that coming from? I used that.
No.
You know, Chinese walls.
Yeah.
You know, it just goes on and on. So every time I hear that, but even small little innocent things, we verge on the area of being PC. But someone says, you know, oh, so-and-so is a good guy. So-and-so is a good guy. And I went, am I a good guy? Would you ever include me in that conversation when you're thinking about who are good guys in your lives? Would I show up? I'm not a good guy. But when we have those conversations, we automatically associate good guy with a white guy.
Well, in the New England area, guys is a little more amorphous, but it's usually a group of people, not anyone.
But listen to those conversations, people that are playing the name game and doing good guys, they'll only toss around net guys. Yeah. Or I ask for referrals to join my community from people, and the list I get back is all guys, all white guys. And I'm like, I need more women, I need more diversity, people of color, like go through your Rolodex and find them for me. And they have to represent a significant, at least a majority of the people on this list. Because they're there, but we just don't naturally think about them. Mm-hmm. So there are these things that we do, and I do them too. And we really have to be aware of them And the more conversations we can have about this, and the more we can be conscious and comfortable having those conversations, the better off we will be.
Yeah, I literally think exposure is half the battle, meaning if you and I can have this conversation and put some language to the problem, meaning show people one way to have this conversation. I do the same thing on social. I have a list of 100 or 200 Black voices that just listening to them and how they're reacting to news. On Instagram, I follow a whole set of different diverse people because I realize that the narrative in my head has been managed by somebody else for too long, right? Like, and so I have these default guys. When I think of a specific guy, it's always a male, right? Like maybe a group is multi-gendered, but that's specific. So like, how can I change my information appetite, or not appetite, my information environment, so that I'm seeing positive and diverse examples and hearing from a lot of different groups.
What I love about what you're doing is that you're being really intentional about it.
Mm.
And I do believe that disruption, change, being a leader requires intentionality. It requires being systematic about it. And if we're going to address issues in our economy with COVID, the future of work, social injustice, we're going to have to be very systematic and intentional to break down a system.
Yeah.
You don't disrupt the system by waking up one morning going, let's get out the hammer and break it apart. It never happens that way because you have to build it up on the other side. And this is going to be incredibly difficult to do because we're talking about disrupting power structures. In the end, everyone's agreed. I love the power and the energy right now and people coming out. But when it comes to significantly shifting power, disrupting the system means shifting power from one place to the other. We're going to see a tremendous amount of resistance from the very same people who are protesting today. And it comes across the board. Comes across the board. It's hard work to dismantle a system, to change it.
Yeah, and you pull the power back even further, and it's the narratives and the mindset of what we tell ourselves, right? Like I've been thinking a lot about, I grew up in a world where the assumption was that you could rank people, which meant one person was better than the other, whether that was racial intelligence, gender, whatever the dividing line was, you could put people on a ladder. And that was repeated in the school system. It's repeated in your professional development life. And until we get beyond, like until diversity is a feature, not a bug of our system, we're gonna get stuck in that view. So let's end with, is there one resource that you've run across in your work that has changed your thinking around this topic recently?
Yes, the Smithsonian Institute National African American Museum has this wonderful series called Talking About Race. And it's a series of small, but very, very rich around topics about being anti-racist, about whiteness, those are the two that I have found to be most helpful. And again, my audience is executives. I can't tell the executive to go read a book.
Yeah.
They just won't, right?
Yeah.
If they want to dig deeper, there's some resources, but they need something that's like a 10, 15-minute read to get up to speed. And I have found that to be the best because it's rich. You can dig down deeper. They have videos, which are great. And so I've been curating the top certain topics by just saying, here are 3 resources instead of a link of 100 things, to be really focused what a leader needs.
I will add one thing that blew my mind in the last 6 months was there's a article as part of the 1619 Project in the New York Times talking about the brutality of American capitalism. And that's where I finally made the connection to why people aren't on the asset side of the balance sheet. And it's because they used to be amortized. So amortization was a innovation of accounting, so that we knew when to kill off our enslaved people and replace them because they weren't producing enough.
Yeah, it was to, amortization and depreciation was an invention of accounting to account for the aging of slaves and their decreasing value because they weren't productive.
And so
when
that
slavery went away, you
moved
took that away. So a lot of the work I'm doing right now is how do we rethink the way we do accounting for businesses to actually understand value? When people are most important assets, but we have no way to account for the investment we make into diversity, into training. If our community, our planet is important, there's no way to account for that, any investments we make into that. So the only thing you're left is the profit motivation. So I fundamentally,
well, you're left with the liability too, because you pay them. So, but I'm actually thinking about the same thing, especially as we shift from production to knowledge. An hour of your time doesn't matter. Like, I can't compare an hour of your time to somebody else's. That's not a standardized unit of value anymore, like that time production thing. So yeah, I'm with you on the accounting needs to really have and
I think the time is ripe for this. Absolutely right, because now when we're thinking how we didn't take care and address these investments in our people, giving them paid time off, the consequence of that is they bring COVID back into the workplace, and we lose a lot more by having people sick and ill and not being able to come to work and everything else.
Or in our whole society.
So you are only as strong as your base community and society is as an organization. So the recognition that we have to invest back into that and just can't be taking it with a capitalist motive. I mean, I love Karl Marx because he understood all the intricacies of what capitalism truly does. And painted out this other picture that says you have to account for this from an economics point of view. I mean, Marx was an economist more so than a communist.
Yeah,
he was an economist. And when you look at what capitalism does without and under full accounting of what the impact of it is, and we haven't done that.
Yeah, that's a great place to end on. And Charlene, thank you so much for your wisdom and your compassion around the topic. Because I
thank you for having the conversation with me.
That's what's going to kind of move us forward, I think. Thank you so much. Take care.
Bye.